Maybe someone once left you somewhere you didn't choose, with no promise of when you'd leave again. Maybe you spent those first weeks counting the days, waiting for your real life to start back up. And maybe, without noticing exactly when, the waiting stopped, and something you never asked for became something you weren't ready to let go of. Here's where it begins. The apple tree still stands at the edge of the old orchard, its trunk thick and split with age, its branches spread wide like something that had decided, long ago, not to be small. Nobody in the county remembers exactly how old it is. What they remember, if they remember anything, is that it almost wasn't there at all. That was the summer everyone in Oakridge County assumed the tree would come down before the leaves turned. A woman's hand rests on the bark now, tracing a scar where a limb once broke away. She has done this before, though the years between then and now have folded into something that no longer feels like distance. Behind her, a smaller hand waits, uncertain whether to reach for the same branch. The story of why this tree is still standing does not begin with the tree at all. It begins with a girl who did not want to be here. Emily was 10 years old the summer her parents drove her to her grandmother's farm and did not say exactly when they would be back. There had been a job in another state, and a house that needed selling, and a series of phone calls Emily was not meant to overhear, but did anyway, pressed against the hallway wall with her knees pulled to her chest. Nobody used the word indefinite, but she understood it anyway, the way children understand weather before adults admit a storm is coming. Her grandmother's farmhouse smelled like wood smoke, and something green she couldn't name. Ruth met her at the car with flowers still on her forearms and did not hug her right away. She only looked at Emily for a moment, the way a person studies a fence line before deciding where to start mending it, and said there was a room ready upstairs if she wanted to see it. Emily did not want to see it. She wanted her old bedroom, her own street, her own life, folded neatly back the way it had been 3 weeks ago. But the car was already pulling out of the driveway, and there was nothing left to do but climb the porch steps and go inside. Supper that first night was quiet in a way Emily's house had never been. Ruth set 2 plates on a table scarred pale with decades of use, said grace and a handful of words rather than a paragraph, and ate without filling the silence between them. On the mantel behind her chair sat a small framed photograph, its edges soft with handling. A man in a work coat, squinting against sun that had gone out of the picture decades ago. Emily glanced at it twice during the meal. Ruth didn't follow her eyes either time, and Emily didn't ask. The first days passed the way early days do in a place that isn't yours yet. Slow, watchful, full of small, unfamiliar sounds. A rooster she hadn't asked for. A screen door that didn't close the same way twice. A dog that watched her from the porch steps for 2 full days before deciding, on the third, to follow her instead. Ruth moved through the house and the yard with a kind of quiet that Emily mistook at first for coldness. She spoke only when there was something worth saying, gave instructions without repeating them, expected Emily to remember. It felt, some days, like living with a woman who had simply stopped needing anyone. Emily would learn later that this wasn't quite true. It was simply a person who had stopped needing to fill silence with anything. It was on the 4th morning that Emily saw the tree properly for the first time. It stood apart from the rest of the orchard, off toward the fence line, its bark gray and cracked in places, several limbs bare, even though summer was already pressing green into everything else. The apples on it, where there were apples at all, hung small and hard, the kind nobody would want to eat. Emily walked the row that morning because Ruth had sent her to check for windfall, and she stopped in front of the tree the way a person stops in front of something that looks wrong. "Why don't you cut it down?" she asked when Ruth came up the row behind her with a bucket in each hand. Ruth didn't answer right away. She set one bucket down at the base of the tree, straightened, and looked up into the branches for a long moment, the kind of look that seemed to be checking on something rather than simply seeing it. "Not yet," she said finally, and picked the bucket back up, and that was the end of the conversation. Emily didn't understand the answer. She wanted a reason, some fact about the tree that would make its ugliness make sense, or at least make it temporary. Now it felt like no answer at all. But there was something in the way Ruth had said it, quiet and certain, that made Emily swallow the next question before it left her mouth. That night, lying in the unfamiliar upstairs room, Emily thought about the tree the way she thought about everything else that summer, as one more thing that had been decided without her, that she was simply expected to live inside of. The first real conversation they had, if it could be called that, happened over a broken kitchen chair in the second week. Ruth set it upside down on newspaper at the table, produced a tin of wood glue and a coil of twine, and waited until Emily wandered close enough out of boredom to ask what she was doing. Fixing it, Ruth said, as if that answered everything. She showed Emily how to work the glue into the loose joint, how to wind the twine tight, and let it sit overnight rather than trust it too soon. "You could nail it," she said. "Nail it and it holds a season, maybe two, and then it's worse than before. Glue it right and give it time, it outlasts you." Emily hadn't thought much of the comparison then. She would think of it again, months later, standing under a different kind of wood entirely. By the second week, Emily had learned the shape of the days without meaning to. Mornings began before the heat did, with eggs to gather and a hose to drag across the garden before the sun made the work unbearable. Ruth never asked twice. She showed a thing once, watched Emily do it once more beside her, and after that expected it done. Emily resented this at first, the way she resented most things about the farm. But there was something almost restful, she noticed later, in a place where the rules didn't change day to day. She noticed, too, that Ruth visited the apple tree the way other people check the mail, not every day, but often enough that its absence would have been strange. Sometimes she carried pruning shears and used them on a branch or two. More often, she carried nothing at all, and simply stood beneath it, one hand resting flat against the trunk, saying nothing, doing nothing that Emily could name as doing. Once, Emily worked up the nerve to ask what she was looking for. Ruth didn't turn around. "Same thing every time," she said, "weathered still trying." It was a strange answer for a tree, Emily thought. Trees didn't try. Trees just grew or didn't. But she filed the sentence away the way she filed away most things that summer, without being sure yet what to do with it. Some things do not grow because we try harder at them. They grow because someone keeps returning, season after season, doing small, unremarkable work that nobody applauds and nobody records. In a world that rewards speed, the quick fix, the fast answer, the problem solved before dinner, that kind of return can look from the outside like stubbornness, or worse, like giving up on finding a real solution. But does everything worth keeping respond to being fixed all at once? Or are there things that only answer to time, to presence, to the same small act performed again and again until it becomes less a task than a shape a life has taken? A tree does not know the difference between neglect and patience while it's happening. It only knows, years later, which one it was. Emily did not think in those terms that summer. She only knew that she watched her grandmother go out to that tree more mornings than not, and that the watching, without her quite noticing, had become a habit of its own. By July, the strangeness of the farm had worn down into something closer to routine. Emily still missed her own room, still counted days on a calendar she kept folded in her nightstand drawer. But she had also learned the sound of the truck when Ruth came back from town, and the particular quiet of the barn in the afternoon heat, and the way the dog would only eat if someone sat with him while he did. She had started, without deciding to, paying attention. Her parents called on Sunday evenings, their voices thin over a connection that dropped every few minutes, promising a date that kept sliding further into autumn. Emily stopped asking when after the third call. She learned instead to listen for what Ruth didn't say when the phone was handed back to her. No reassurance, no soft promise that it would all be fine soon. Just a nod, and the next chore already waiting. When September came and the stay had clearly outgrown a summer, Ruth enrolled her at the small county school without much discussion, and Emily started classes 3 weeks late, in a building that smelled like chalk dust and radiator heat. She said little those first days, sat at the edge of things, answered only when asked. It was a boy in her class, of all people, who mentioned Ruth first, said his father always spoke well of the woman out on the old Whitmore Road, the one who still did things the right way when everyone else had gone looking for shortcuts. Emily hadn't thought of her grandmother as someone other people spoke of at all. She turned the sentence over for days afterward, the way she'd turned over not yet. Late that same month, her teacher assigned a family tree, names, dates, a line drawn back as far as anyone in the house could remember. Emily brought the blank worksheet to the kitchen table that evening and asked Ruth for the name she needed. Ruth gave her mother's name, her father's, her own, filled in the boxes without hesitation until she reached the line beside her own name meant for a husband. She paused there only a moment, wrote Arthur Whitmore in careful block letters and the years beside it, and said nothing further before handing the paper back. Emily noticed the second date was almost 7 years old. She didn't ask what it meant. She only copied it onto her worksheet exactly as written and turned it in without adding anything of her own. One Saturday in October, a neighbor named Colin stopped by with a load of fence posts Ruth had asked to borrow and stayed long enough to look out toward the orchard and shake his head at the old apple tree standing bare-limbed among the others. Man could get a good winter of firewood off that thing, he said, not unkindly, more the way a person states a fact they assume everyone already agrees with. Ruth only thanked him for the posts and said the tree wasn't for burning. Collins didn't push it. He'd clearly said the same thing before and heard the same answer. Emily, listening from the porch, understood for the first time that her grandmother's patience with that tree wasn't only hers to question. Other people had wondered too and gotten the same 3 words in return. One evening in late July, Emily found her grandmother sitting on the porch steps well after the day's work should have ended, looking out toward the orchard with a stillness Emily hadn't seen in her before. She didn't say anything, only sat down a step below her, and after a while, Ruth spoke without being asked. "Some years this place is too quiet," she said. Then, after a pause, "Some years it isn't." Emily asked, carefully, which kind of year this one was. Ruth was quiet long enough that Emily thought she wouldn't answer at all. "Working on it," she said finally, and left it there, her eyes still on the dark line of the orchard against the last of the light. Emily didn't understand that either, not then. But she remembered it the way she remembered the answer about the tree. Not yet, filed away, waiting for a context that hadn't arrived. In mid-August, before the storm, the old tree dropped what little fruit it had managed that year, small hard apples scattered thin across the grass beneath it. Ruth had Emily gather them into a basket rather than leave them to rot, and that evening the two of them stood at the kitchen counter peeling and coring what the tree had given, the smell of cinnamon and cooking fruit filling the house in a way that made it feel, for the first time, less like a place Emily was staying and more like a place she was living. The apples were small and tart and made a modest pot of sauce, nowhere near enough to can and store the way the other tree's fruit would be come September. Ruth didn't comment on how little there was. She only ladled it into 2 bowls, set one in front of Emily, and ate her own without a word about waste or worth or whether the effort had been justified by the result. The storm came in the last week of August, the kind that rolled in fast off the flat country to the west and left the whole farm smelling like wet dust. In ozone by morning, Emily woke to branches down across the yard and one long limb torn clean off the old apple tree, lying broken in the grass like something that had given up mid-argument. She was certain, walking out to look at it with Ruth, that this would finally be the day. A branch that size, gone entirely. Surely now there was nothing left to wait for. Ruth crouched beside the fallen limb and turned it over once, studying the break the way she'd studied the tree itself that first morning. Then she stood, dusted off her knees, and went to get the saw. She's not cutting the tree, Emily realized, watching her grandmother work. She's cutting away what already died on its own. They cleared the limb together that morning, dragging the pieces to the burn pile, the wet wood heavier than Emily expected, bark slick and cold under her hands. The yard smelled of broken greenwood and rain-soaked dust long after the sky had cleared. Ruth did not say a single word about giving up on the tree. She only worked, steady and unhurried, the way she worked at everything, as if the storm had simply been one more thing the tree needed to survive before it could keep going. That night, Emily lay awake listening to the last of the wind die down outside her window, turning over the morning's work in her mind. She had expected, more than once that summer, to feel triumphant the day her grandmother finally admitted defeat about that tree. Instead, she found herself oddly relieved that the day hadn't come. She didn't examine the feeling too closely. She only noted it, the way she'd noted not yet, and let it sit. Autumn came and went in a blur of shortening days. October brought Emily's first frost, her first sight of the orchard gone golden bare, her first understanding that a farm did not stop needing tending just because the growing season had. She learned to stack wood so it would season properly, to close the coop before the light dropped past a certain color in the sky, to recognize by smell alone when Ruth was baking something meant to be shared rather than just eaten. There was one evening in early November when Ruth came in late from the barn, moving slower than usual. Her hands stiff from cold in a day that had run longer than most. She sat heavily at the table without taking off her coat, and for the first time all season, said she was tired in a voice that admitted it rather than simply stating a fact. Emily, without being told, filled the kettle and set it on the stove, the way she'd watched Ruth do for her more than once that summer. Neither of them spoke about it afterward. It wasn't the kind of thing that needed thanking. By November, there was a rhythm to the days that Emily had stopped fighting, even if she still didn't call a home out loud. Her parents' calls had grown shorter, apologetic in a way that had started to feel less like a promise and more like a habit. Emily had stopped marking the calendar by then. It felt, some nights, like marking time against something that wasn't coming. The cold set in hard by January, the kind of cold that turned the yard to iron and made every chore take twice as long in gloves that never quite fit right. Emily had grown used to the farm's dormant season the way she'd grown used to everything else. Not with excitement, but with a settled kind of familiarity, the sense of a place that had stopped being foreign and started, quietly, being simply where she was. Twice that winter, Emily caught her grandmother standing at the kitchen window in the early dark before chores. Looking out toward the orchard, though, there was nothing to see yet but shapes against shapes. Neither time did Ruth explain what she was watching for, and neither time did Emily ask. She had learned, by then, that some questions in this house answered themselves eventually, if she was patient enough to wait for it. It was on a still, gray morning in late February, the air sharp enough to hurt on the way in, that Ruth woke her early and told her to dress warm. There was work to do at the tree. Emily followed her out through frost-stiffened grass, breath fogging in front of them both, to where the old apple tree stood bare and silent against a white sky. Its buds were tight and small along the branches, not yet open, waiting the way everything on the farm seemed to be waiting in. February, for a signal only the land itself could give. "This is when you do it," Ruth said, pulling the pruning shears from the loop on her belt. "Before the buds break." While it's still sleeping, she showed Emily how to find a bud that faced outward, away from the center of the tree, and how to angle the blade. 45 degrees, she said, just above it, so rain would run off the cut instead of pooling and rotting the new growth beneath. Too steep, she warned, and the bud dries out before spring. Too flat, and water sits on the wound all season. It wasn't complicated, she said. It only had to be done right, and done at the right time, and not rushed for the sake of being finished sooner. She walked the lower branches first, naming what she was looking for as she went. Wood that crossed another branch and rubbed it raw, wood that grew inward instead of out, wood that simply hadn't woken with the rest of the tree in springs past and never would again. Emily washed her hands more than her face, the way they turned each branch gently before deciding, never cutting on the first look. Emily made her first cut clumsily, the shears biting through a thin dead branch with a dry, papery snap. The smell that rose from it surprised her. Not rot, but something dry and faintly bitter, old wood giving up whatever moisture it had left, mixed with a fainter, sweeter note from a live branch nearby, where sap had only just begun to wake beneath the bark. Ruth made the next cut herself, on a thicker branch near the trunk, and when the wood gave way with a heavier crack, she went still. She stood there a moment, shears still closed around the cut, looking at the pale, raw wood exposed underneath. Emily waited, unsure whether to speak, the cold pulling at her fingers even through her gloves. "He always hated deadwood," Ruth said at last, and moved the shears to the next branch. She didn't explain who. She didn't need to. Emily had heard her grandfather's name exactly twice that whole winter, always in passing, always followed by a change of subject. But something in the way Ruth said it, quiet and certain, like a fact rather than a memory, told Emily this was not a stranger they were talking about. Every winter since he'd been gone, Ruth kept trimming the tree the way Arthur once had, the same angle, the same season, the same unhurried attention to wood that had stopped serving the tree and needed to be let go. He hadn't planted it on their wedding day, the way Emily might have imagined, hearing the story told differently by someone who wanted it simpler. He'd planted it the first spring after they moved onto the farm, when the house was still half-furnished and the fences still needed mending, and neither of them had any money to speak of, only the land and each other. He'd said, setting the sapling into the ground with his own 2 hands, that they finally had a place of their own worth planting something in. Ruth had been pruning that same tree every February since the year he died, not because a book told her to, and not because the orchard needed it more than any other tree on the farm. She did it because it was the one thing that still felt, some years, like a conversation. Emily didn't say anything. She only picked up the shears again, found the next dead branch, and made the cut the way she'd been shown. 45 degrees, just above a bud facing out toward the light. Somewhere above them a woodpecker started up against a fence post, steady and unhurried, and neither of them mentioned it, though both of them heard it as a kind of answer. They worked in that same quiet for the better part of an hour, branch by branch, the pile beneath the tree, growing while the sky stayed the same flat gray the whole morning through. Once, reaching for a high limb, Ruth's hand brushed the trunk the way it had that very first morning in June, and Emily understood, watching it, that this was not a habit her grandmother had picked up somewhere. It was something closer to a promise, kept once a year, whether anyone was there to see it or not. They finished before noon, the ground beneath the tree littered with cut branches, the canopy above them thinner, but somehow more alive for it, open now to whatever sun the gray sky offered. Ruth gathered the cuttings into a pile, without a word, and Emily helped her, and neither of them spoke again about what had been said beneath the tree that morning. It didn't need repeating. It had already landed exactly where it needed to. Spring came late that year, the way it often did in Oakridge County, but when it came, the old apple tree came with it. Not transformed, not suddenly beautiful, but fuller than it had been the summer before, its blossoms thicker along the branches Ruth had cleared. Emily's parents arrived in April to take her home, full of apology and relief in equal measure, already talking about her old room and her old school and how good it would feel to have things back to normal. Emily let them talk. She carried her bag out to the car herself, and on the way, stopped at the fence line, looking back at the tree the way a person looks at something they didn't expect to miss. Ruth walked her out, said little, and at the last moment before Emily climbed into the back seat, said only that the tree would need looking at again come next February, in case Emily was around to help. It wasn't quite an invitation and wasn't quite a fact. Emily said she would be. She did not know yet that she would return to that farm every February for the next 2 decades. She only knew, climbing into the car, that she would. The years that followed folded into each other the way years do. Emily grown, a farm of her own eventually, a husband, a daughter with her mother's same watchful eyes. But every February, without needing to be asked twice, she came back to Oakridge County, to the tree at the edge of the orchard, and pruned it the way she'd been taught on a cold morning when she was 10 years old. Ruth was gone now these past 6 years. The farmhouse sold to a young family who kept the orchard mostly as it was. But the tree remained, and so did the ritual, passed down the way certain things are, not through explanation, but through repetition, until repetition becomes its own kind of inheritance. Emily kept the small framed photograph from Ruth's mantel after the farmhouse sold, and it sat now on a shelf in her own kitchen, a man in a work coat squinting against sun. That had gone out of the picture decades before Maya was ever born. Maya had asked about it once, the way children ask about anything unfamiliar, and Emily had answered only that he'd planted the tree they trimmed every winter. She hadn't said more than that. She hadn't needed to. This is where the story returns to where it began. A woman's hand resting against old bark, tracing a scar where a limb once broke away and a smaller hand waiting behind her. Maya was 7, and this was her second winter watching her mother work the tree without quite understanding why. "Why do we trim it every winter?" she asked, the same question almost word for word that Emily had once asked a woman who was no longer here to answer it. Emily didn't turn around right away. She looked up into the bare branches for a long moment, the way someone checks on something rather than simply seeing it, and reached for the shears looped at her belt. "Come here," she said. She knelt behind her daughter, guided the small hand holding the blade to a bud facing outward, angled at 45 degrees above the swelling wood, and helped her make the cut. The branch fell into the frost-stiffened grass with a dry, papery snap. Maya looked down at it, then up at the tree, then back at her mother, apparently satisfied for now with an answer that wasn't really an answer at all. She didn't ask again. She only reached for the next branch on her own, the way she'd seen it done, waiting for her mother's hand to guide hers once more. Somewhere above them, the rest of the tree stood waiting, the way it always had, for whoever would come back next. Is there something in your own family still cared for every year without anyone quite explaining why? And whose hands do you picture guiding yours, the way Ruth once guided Emily's beneath that old apple tree? Tell us in the comments below. We read every one of them. It means more than you know. Until the next story from Oakridge County, take care of the small things too.